Hi there. It's your lucky day today. You are going to get to experience the global premiere of a brand new podcast. And so I'm going to ask you to close your eyes, and the lights will be dimmed, and you will experience something very, very exciting. Please close your eyes.
Out here training once again with Dad, and I think everything's come crashing down on my head about the reality of what's going to be ahead with this journey to the South Pole.
We must cross 5,000 crevasses. If a crevasse bridge breaks, you go through and don't come home. It's going to hurt doing this.
No life around, no flowers, no birds, no insects, no bugs, no bacteria. Feeling ready for this expedition?
I'm ready, Bunny.
Be frightened, be very frightened, because where we're going wants you dead.
It's going to be a challenge. The fear is real. 60 days, surviving solely off renewable energy. It's going to be one hell of a story.
Yes, it's going to be a hell of a story. And that was the GoalsCast. And it's a podcast that actually explores if we can change the world. And we say yes. The people in our team says, yes, we can make some differences. And we need to make those differences because all we need is to know what is the world's to-do list. And there is a master plan called the Global Goals that basically has the entire set of points that we need to do to change the world and make it better for all. And that's the only plan we have. There's no plan B, but there's no planet B either. And the complexity of the issues that we're dealing with cannot be explored explaining 140 characters. And millennials are increasingly asking for social justice and content that is related to what they want, which is buying with their beliefs. So my co-host and I, Edie and I, decided to create a platform to highlight those champions and to highlight that we are making progress. CBS News Digital came on board and said, we want to actually partner with you. And not only them, but the entire UN and the UN system came along and said, we trust you to tell our story. And we were not alone. All of a sudden, a lot of partners have joined us, and we just launched last week on Wednesday. And it is actually quite interesting to see how people want to not only be informed, but also take action. And one of our partners, Bono's daughter, Jordan, created actually the action campaign for all of the things that we're doing. So when we're telling you that we're going to tell stories, the stories that we're going to be telling are the stories like Brenda. Brenda crossed the Rio Grande, actually was separated from her parents, sneaked in the back of a truck to get to Dallas, where she got an internship in Google. And now she is actually making some progress. And what we know is that the narrative out there is really fractured. And people don't really know what's true, what's not, and what to believe. So we need to actually extract and provide as much facts and information, facts and figures to people so that they can make their own judgment about the things that are so complex, beyond politics, beyond the negative news that we're seeing. And what we're promising in our podcast is that when you hear these stories, you will understand the life of someone like Pretty that didn't have hopes and didn't have a dream. But the story I'm going to tell today is the story of Robert, the one that I'm launching today, is the story of Robert and Barney Swan, father and son, that started a crusade to Antarctica, 60 days, 600 miles, only on renewable energy. And all of that suffering to make the point that we, each of us, can make, if they can make it in Antarctica only in renewable energy, all of us can make a difference. And all of us can actually try to understand how these stories matter, not only for us here, but to everybody. And they are flying right now as we speak to Davos, because they're going to come to us. We're going to be telling the stories in 12 times this year, but not only those very produced stories that I really hope that you can hear, but also we're going to be around the world in a global GoalsCast tour. And this is where I would like you to ask. So do you really think that we can change the world? Well, hell yes, we can. And we can do it if we act together. And doing it, it means understanding that the stories of Preeti, the stories of Brenda matter. And if you listen to our podcast and you share it around with your friends, you share the stories of people that somehow need to be understood. And we also have, we're a non-for-profit, so if you are a musician like Peter Gabriel giving us music, you can give us design, music, art. But the most important is for you to actually understand that podcast is a growing mechanism for people to open their hearts, and we want you to enjoy this podcast. So, can we change the world? Hell yes.
From Claudia Romo Edelman and her passion around this new project, which is very exciting. And I'd also like to ask to come to the stage legendary podcast creator, Matt Lieber, who's the co-founder of Gimlet Media. And it happens to live in Brooklyn, which is where I live, but we had to meet here. Go figure. So thank you for that great presentation, opening it up. And as somebody who works in social impact, I am so beyond excited that this is happening. But I think it's good if we just kind of step back for a moment and talk about podcasts. I mean, they almost kind of came out of nowhere a few years ago. And I'd love to get your thoughts on, why have podcasts become so ubiquitous? Why, if I was to see, show of hands, how many of you listen to podcasts 3 times a week? 5 times a week? Okay, well, that's quite a bit. And you wouldn't have seen that 5-6 years ago. So, Matt, why don't I ask you that first?
Why are podcasts a thing?
Yeah, and growing and growing and growing. It's like 10% each year.
21%.
There you go.
Yeah, if you look at the number of podcasts, so I'm Matt Lieber. I'm the co-founder and president at Gimlet Media, and we're a media company where everything begins in audio, and we started with podcasts. And yeah, that's right, growing very fast. If you look at the last 2 years in the U.S. market alone, which is where we operate, it's grown 40% over the last 24 months, right? And there are now 70 million people every month that listen to podcasts. I think it's a couple things. One is there's just more of these in everyone's pocket. There's more connected cars coming online. Half of radio listening happens in cars, so now that we can listen to on-demand audio in cars, that's expanding the listener base. And then there's just been an explosion of really interesting content. We started the company 3.5 years ago, and the month that we launched the company, there was a show called Serial that came about. Have any of you guys heard of Serial?
Yes. It's
a true crime show. It's a true crime show about a murder, but it also explains the justice system and brings you really close into a world of Baltimore in the past. And that was just an incredible feat of storytelling that brought new people in. Gimlet launched a show called Startup, which was a documentary about what it's like to start a business. We told our own story through the medium of podcast, and that brought in new listeners. So now all of a sudden you're getting these kinds of stories that just are more personal and more connected than what you would get by looking at a screen.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
That's the thing I love about audio, is how direct the connection is that you have. Like the piece that you were playing at the beginning, it says, we're gonna have to cross 5,000 crevasses.
Yes.
Now, in my head, I saw 5,000 crevasses, and all of a sudden I was there.
Yeah.
And that just doesn't happen when you are scrolling on a screen.
Yeah. And I was telling him that I am the most humble person because he is like the hero and the role model of podcasts, and sitting him next to him. I'm a humanitarian worker. I know about poverty and girls and so on, but like talking about the future of podcasts, and I feel super humble but also passionate about it. And the reason why we got so many partners from, like the United Nations and NGOs and so on saying like, here it is, take my brand, take my story, I'll give it all, is because they saw the numbers, they saw the authenticity. And so just to, I think that one thing that struck me is that 42 million people listen to podcasts weekly, not only us do that. And that's 5 times bigger than the number of people that go to the movies each week. So you see the growth, right? Like it's 21 to 25% growth. And the reason why for me it was so important is, again, I said, the complexity of the issues we deal with, migration, you can't actually just explain it in an ad. I'm sorry, you can't. It's complex. It has so many parts. We just need to tell the story in something that allows us for that. And it is not affected by trust. You know, like more than 50% of the world has disconnected from watching news. It's just like everybody's shutting down and saying, like, I don't trust news organizations anymore. I don't know what's real from not, what is not. Trust is not affected, you know, like podcast is not affected by trust. It's a medium that is like super authentic and
it's intimate. It's intimate.
Look, I mean, like, I hate to say this, but to use this example, but it's really, as in, like, you have the television out there. You have your phone here or your newspapers here. Podcast is in you. It's almost like a Tampax. I mean, it's so in you. It's like totally in you. It's like so inside you that you develop this relationship with something that is so, like, you put it on your ear. You like, it's like in you. Yeah. And it just allows that to, and people catch it immediately. If the content is not good and you're not authentic, it comes across. I'm Mexican. I have this heavy accent. Not even Siri can understand what I'm saying. You know, like, but overall, I'm putting my heart on the table. I'm being vulnerable and saying, like, yeah, okay, you might not understand 1/3 of I say, but we have transcriptions, you know, like of the podcast, because it has to be authentic. I wouldn't want to go into accent optimization or just like having someone else, because you have to talk about the things that you care about in a way that, you know, like, I think it's picking up on podcast tremendously.
If I could ask, though, Claudia, I mean, this is risque in the sense that it's social good being shared over podcasts, and it's very, very new. You don't see programming that is solely dedicated to, you know, the global goals.
Right.
So tell me how you kind of came up with this idea. How did it come into being, and where do you see it going in 1, 2, 3 years?
So, I mean, like, the first one is when I was running communications for the Secretary General at the United Nations for the Sustainable Development Goals, and I am a super fan of the Sustainable Development Goals, Google. I mean, like, I'm anal, compulsive, obsessive, and this is a list, the to-do list, 17 goals, 169 characters. We know what we need to do to make the world a better place. We know that we can be the first generation that can eradicate extreme poverty, but we also know that we can be the last generation to mitigate the impact of climate change, and we can make the world for a better place for everybody, thanks to the global goals. We know it. So I'm an obsessive person about it. So when I was working in that office and I was telling Matthew, part of my job felt a little bit like a shrink every week, where literally presidents of companies or countries or ambassadors came to talk, to be listened, to say, I am making an effort, I'm trying to set up gender equal pay, and, you know, like, I have 6,000 employees and it's not easy because not all the regions have, and I'm like, oh, okay. And they were like, thank you, bye. So that was happening all the time. So people needed to talk. And there's so many people making good things. And we're just not providing the platforms to not only highlight their progress, their efforts, but we are making progress. The world is better. Well, we are making it. And so unless you provide that platform to make people say, like, you know what, it's true. It's true that there's so many bad news, but guess what? There's a great deal of beauty out there. There's a great, you know, like, deal of hope, and people want to consume that and want to share stories and also know who's good, who's bad. Where do I buy? Why do I make my consumer choice for companies that have a heart or not? So it just came out of necessity, because it was, you know, like, people needed to talk, people needed to know and make choices, and I think that we're going to be better off if we all, you know, like, increase the amount of platforms for these stories.
Well, and just a clarification, the Sustainable Development Goals were actually created with business, NGOs, government working together. The previous set of goals were very much just NGO focused and UN focused. So I think overall, these are going to have a much better chance to succeed and for us to actually reach these goals. But Matthew, can you give us an overview of how brands are actually, because inevitably there's going to have to be some mechanism to pay or to cover the costs. So given the purview that you sit on.
Yeah, so when we started Gimlet, we had, like, the company came out of the fact that my co-founder Alex and I both came out of radio. And I was a kid I was obsessed with audio when I was a kid. Like, I would listen to...
Were you a geek?
Yeah, I would listen to, in the States, NPR is the national broadcaster. I listened to that every day on the way to school in the backseat of my parents' car. And I would get home and I would listen to local sports radio. And then I had a clock radio that sat on the side of my bed. I promise I'm going to answer your question, by the way.
No. This is much more interesting.
I had a clock radio that sat on the side of my bed so I could have a voice rolling into my ear as I fell asleep. And I had all these people in my life, these voices that I had a connection to that I'd never met, but I felt like I knew. And when we started, the idea came about because I spent a decade producing music and entertainment and news at MTV and NPR. And when we started, the insight was there's a new medium being born. Mm-hmm. And every time a new medium gets born, new media companies get built. And so if you can go back 100 years, and in the 1920s, the new medium was radio, and that's when CBS got built.
Yeah.
In the 1980s, the new medium was cable television, and that's when MTV got built. That's when CNN got built. So Alex, my co-founder, and I both thought we could build a new kind of media company around on-demand audio, and that meant new ways of telling stories, and it also meant new ways of working with advertising. So we created a new ad model, which was basically a native way of doing advertising that feels like it's part of the show you're listening to. So all the ads you hear on Gimlet are made by us. They come in the voice of the host of the show, although it's totally transparent that you're listening to an advertisement. And we work with the biggest advertisers in the world. So we work with Ford Motor Company and Gatorade and Dell, Intel, Apple, Virgin. And
see, and I love that they're all going to be exposed to the global goals.
And the thing is, it's actually a great medium. Audio is a great medium for brand advertising because you take this thing, which is a company, which is distant and faceless, and if you can tell a story around it, you create affinity.
Right.
And you create a sense of emotional connection. That's what audio is really good at, creating moments of emotional connection. And you can do that with brands. And so, yeah, it turns out I think it's the most effective way to do branding on mobile is through audio.
Sure. Your story about, being a young boy and, being avid listener of all these shows and things. I remember when I was 8 or 9 years old on Cape Cod. If you use those, this tells you how old I am. But you know those little five and dime radios that just have an antenna. I don't even know what they're called. But you could pick up Soviet Union radio all the way from Cape Cod back then, and I would lie there at night and just listen to it. It was English broadcasting. But anyhow, back to the topic at hand.
I mean, just one thing about what Matthew was saying is, if you really believe that millennials, and I actually start believing that baby boomers are in the same situation, all of a sudden baby boomers and millennials are somehow in the same group in terms of some of the choices and affinities that they have. But if you start looking at that, the audience of podcasts are highly educated, are educated people that want to learn more and want to get in depth into a subject. So it's by far easier, if I would be a brand, it's by far easier to say...
I think you are a brand, actually.
No, but if I would have a brand... if I would be a company, I would like to talk to people that are, going to be. If I am doing something good, like all the brands that you have, I think that podcast would be the right place to go because it's not only the most intimate, but also it's the one that has a how do you say that? Translation. Yeah. The easiest. We, for example, have 130 million captive audience just from the partners. I mean, tell me which brand wouldn't want to be seen by the activists and the tree huggers that all the partners, like the UN partners and so on, have, if they are doing something already good and they would like to target them. So it's kind of easy to also tailor.
Sure. So what I always seem to have trouble is finding the podcast I want to listen to. You're clearly an expert in guiding people. What would you advise? Because there's a lot of content out there.
What should you listen to?
No, but how do you go about finding?
I would say start with the global goals.
Well, yes, of course. That's a given. But in terms of, sometimes it can be overwhelming. You go to the Apple store and there's hundreds and hundreds and thousands.
Yeah, so if I meet you here this weekend, I will probably ask you to give me your phone. And then I'll ask you what's the best book you've read lately, or what's your favorite television show, and then I'll make a bespoke recommendation based on that. Of course, that doesn't scale. I think one of the reasons we're building Gimlet is because the idea was, can we build a brand that speaks to quality in the medium of podcasts, or the HBO of audio. Every show that HBO releases, you may not love everything they do, but everything is like, oh, that's going to be good, or that's worth a try. So that's what Gimlet's trying to do. So if you like tech, you should listen to Reply All. It's our show about the internet. If you're interested in business, check out Startup. If you like a thriller, listen to Homecoming. It's our fiction show. And I think, one of the reasons podcast hasn't grown faster, right? It's big, it's growing fast, but it's still, it's a quarter of people who listen to podcasts every month. It should be 100%.
Yeah.
90% of people listen to the radio every month, and only a quarter listen to podcasts. There's way more interesting stuff going on in podcasts. So why is that? Well, one is discovery is challenged.
Yes.
And there's a lot of smart people working on this, right? So our friends up at Spotify are working on this. The folks at Pandora are working on this. Apple is spending time here. So I think that is going to get fixed.
Yeah.
Sure. So tell us about the launch. Okay, this is the global launch of the Global Goals podcast. But then how are you going to get the word out?
So, we're a non-for-profit, right? So this is not, and all the advertisement is done by CBS, and the sponsorships model is not ours. But what we really, and podcast is wonderful, but also it's cruel. So you can have a video on YouTube for 5 years and no one bothers you, and you can leave it there, and if you have a podcast, you have a time clock, and you have a ticker to actually say what's your algorithm. Are you going to make it for the first day, the 24 hours? Let me see your numbers to see whether we feature you or not. Or, you have 8 weeks. So for us, the first 8 weeks are going to make it or break it in terms of whether we can get the numbers. That's why I was saying, please download our podcast. Please listen to it. It matters because it's not about our podcast. It's about the impact that a podcast can have really in making people aware. Mm-hmm. Do you know the amount of misperception and misconceptions that a country like America has on migration? Oh. If we can't help reconstruct the narrative of an issue if we could, through one podcast, through one story, reconstruct a narrative,
the average
we would be
American
doing a hell of a job.
The average American doesn't know the difference between a migrant, a refugee, and an immigrant.
Right. So altogether, I think that if we're counting on influencers, and for example, having him tweet about the podcast, or having him give us advertisement on his multiple podcasts about a non-for-profit would be amazing. And
so
those are the
these folks where can they find it?
In globalgoalscast.org, yeah. Or iTunes, or wherever you find your...
Apple Podcast.
Apple Podcast.
Okay, good.
Apple Podcast, that would be the one.
Action item, everybody needs to go and check it out.
Right. But you see, I think that also what he was saying is really interesting, because I think that this group has a lot of technology, and you should actually just get a little bit more your pencil, sharpen your pencils in terms of looking at the future, as in this is not a short-term, thing. It's almost you're starting to see in 2002, when social media was already starting, and it was already there, but a lot of people didn't know about it. So we need technology to make it more easy to discover. The discoverability of podcasts is making me work like hell, right? Because if I wanted to hear what did he say in his podcast and I search for it, there's no way I can find it. I just have to listen to the entire 30 minutes or whatever to see what was the quote that he said. So what we're doing is actually extracting quotes and extracting figures and pushing them through social, and that has a lot of cost. Why wouldn't be, technology companies just going and coming up with, smart ways to make, search easier for podcasts, and actually looking at that the future will be voice and will be audio, and that's I would love to see Alexa being interactive. Okay, so hi Alexa, tell me more about Robert Swan in this podcast, or why don't you? Hi Alexa, I love that. Why don't I sign a petition for whatever congressman or some those are the kind of things that will help. Exactly.
Yeah. Well, we are just about out of time. Time flies when you're having fun. So we didn't even get to half our questions. But you two are going to be around, so people can come and get more information and learn more about Gimlet. And I would encourage you, though, to go ahead and check out the Global Goals podcast. You have to know it's going to be exciting and interesting with somebody like Claudia behind it. So thank you, Matt Lieber, and thank you, Claudia Romo-Edelman.
Thank you.
Wonderful, and thank you
Thank
all.
you.
Thank you all.